down to basics. Of course, we are talking about a matter, we are discussing a matter which is absolutely of the essence to national life. It's at the foundation of our way of life. I don't know about the way of life, but at least national life and our expectations as citizens and our expectations of governance. So we have the system of democracy constitutionalized. We have the preamble of the 1978 Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution, which describes Sri Lanka or recognizes Sri Lanka as a democracy, in fact, a socialist democracy. And then the Election Commission works on this basis, and Article 3 of the Constitution, which is about the foundation of democracy, the fact that the recognition of the principle that it's in the people that sovereignty lies. So the ultimate decision-making authority lies with the people. And it goes on to say, as you know, that sovereignty, powers of governance, franchise, and fundamental rights. But today we know that the franchise itself is a fundamental right. It is so recognized by international law that Sri Lanka has subscribed to. We see this in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes the right to participate in the governance process as a human right, and indeed says or declares that the will of the people shall be the basis of governance. And then we have our own Supreme Court judgments which have reinforced this position. In the famous case of Varuna Karunatilaka against the Election Commission, the Supreme Court very categorically pointed out, franchise stand alone, that it is a human right or a fundamental right that's recognized by the Constitution. So this is foundational to the existence of our republic. That's what we are talking about. As from an institutional perspective, the 19th Amendment went further by establishing the Independent Election Commission. And I think to a great extent, the establishment of independent fields, particularly the election process, the electoral dimension, has seen, I think, a very positive development with its establishment. Then, of course, we have separate legislation, which provides for the processes of the parliamentary election and presidential election and so on. So as a society, and particularly as a polity, as citizens living in an organized political system, there's no doubt about it. And I think the high point, as an observer of matters political and legal, I think the Aragale of 2022 was a high citizenship. There is the recognition that governance must be based, indeed, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, the will of the people. I think people in Sri Lanka are invested in that. Even though sometimes you hear various types of statements like, we need a dictator in Sri Lanka, etc. Nonetheless, I think we are invested in the fact that we should be electing our representatives. However, even though there are these democratic, expectations, I think the struggle for us over the past 94 years, since the Donamo reforms and the introduction of the Universal Adult in 1931, has been this contradiction of having democracy as a system of governance imposed on what I think largely as a sort of a neo-feudalistic and cultural context. And it is this tension between, the sort of feudalistic practices and, cultural values on the one hand, and on the other hand, these expectations, this expectation of democracy that has caused all these tensions. So we've seen in the past, in particular, and even today, I think to a great extent, the entrenchment of patronage politics. So don't tell me I'm talking politics and this is an independent commission. I too was part of an independent commission. But we need to face these realities, I think, to get to where we want to go. So these tensions are there. So there has been this patronage politics, an idea that people are the sort of vassals or, people who sort of concentrate around or gravitate around a patron. And the political dealings, quite often, are based on that idea of patronage politics. But we would still say we want democracy and we are indeed democratic citizens. But the practices sometimes are at variance with what democracy would expect. So theoretically, liberal democracy is based on of the voter being free-thinking, very autonomous individual who can make free and informed decisions on electing one's representatives and indeed the governance. Because after all, it's in people that the sovereignty, or individual voters, that sovereignty lies. So I think we have to ask ourselves these questions. Is there really heightened awareness amongst us? Even after 94 years of voting, there hasn't been a single instance, except 2022, where governments have changed, except through elections. We have not had military coups. The only exception, I think, was the uprising of 2022. But can we ask ourselves and ask this question and honestly answer, is there heightened awareness in society about the social contract? Do we see elections as forging a social contract? For I think most of the people in Sri Lanka, democracy is about elections. And rightly so, because elections is the starting point of democracy, where we forge a social contract and ask the elected representatives to govern us. But is there that understanding of what this social contract is about? That the social contract means that we transfer our powers of governance, as said in Article 3 of the Constitution, to a set of elected representatives temporarily and on condition. This is not unconditional transfer of power, but it is absolutely conditional transfer of power, and that democracy expects limited governmental powers. Because there is a sense, sometimes I have to say with due respect, even in jurisprudence, for example, when you look at the executive presidency, a sort of a recognition that there can be vast powers in at least one organ of the government. That is not so, absolutely not. Because no constitution, which calls itself democratic and worth its salt, can say that any branch of the government will have unlimited vast powers, because democracy is all about limited government. So do we have this idea? I think we have to ask ourselves these questions as we proceed. But of course, much has changed for the better. There's no doubt about it. So I think in the past 94 years, when we answer these questions, in my own view, and forgive me, I mean, we may not agree entirely on these matters, but in my view, I think we have, as a country which has been invested in the idea of a universal adult franchise, we've been dealing or addressing mainly procedural democracy. How do we hold good elections? How do we hold, elections with integrity, free and fair elections, and so on? And for example, I mean, it's been decades since I, like many of you, had joined election monitors. And we saw how decades ago, until recently actually, we were dealing with extremely primitive forms of practices like violence, snatching of ballot boxes and things like that. And then, so how do we have violence-free elections, post-election periods? How do we get independent regulatory authorities? And the 19th Amendment was very much about getting independent regulatory authorities. And then, as we heard during the second panel discussion, how do we have solid and efficient administration of elections? And I must say my own experience and observations over the years has have told me that the Sri Lankan system has come a long way, and administratively it's quite sophisticated. And then now we are working on how to make, the registers inclusive, etc. So these are very much procedural dimensions, but absolutely vital to forge this social contract in a meaningful way. They are very, very important of the democratic process. So then, of course, there are other issues that we have to work on, and I saw quite a lot of these issues are dealt with by the researchers. And I would, at the beginning, I really wanted to congratulate the Election Commission for this initiative. I think, as I see it from the message of the commissioners, the whole idea is to have research-based studies so that policy decisions can be made. In a research-based manner, which is absolutely the need, and I really commend the Election Commission for that. So we need to work on, similarly, procedural dimensions, equitable delimitation, absolute essence. So we have an independent delimitation commission, and we know that there are right now countries in all democracies that are finding delimitation to be very problematic because of gerrymandering that's going on. So that has to be worked out. And then having fair electoral systems. What sort of do we want first past the post? Do we want proportional representation? Do we want mixed system? We've got to come to a conclusion, and we've got to have constitutional reform in that regard. Then issues of election financing and ceilings on expenditure, partially dealt with, I think, already. And then, of course, anti-corruption measures. In a legal educator my entire adult life. And we all recognize, I think, as many of you, I'm sure the majority of you are products of the free education system, the power of the education system. The power of the education system to build, our systems of governance, the economic systems, technology, healthcare systems, etc., etc. But has our education really contributed to this democratization process? And to me, personally, and through my observations and experiences, I think not very much. The vast majority of students really have not had a good exposure to civic education. I mean, political science education, I think, is a much more specialized area. Not very many students do political education, which draws from political theory, is still very weak in Sri Lanka. So I think when you look at the Kannangara reforms, when we look at the Kannangara report, it's very clear the visionary that Dr. Kannangara was. The Kannangara reports pointedly mentions the fact that the free education system in Sri Lanka, not merely to create